I want you to imagine standing at the edge of a harbor at the bottom of the world. And I do mean the bottom of the world. You are hundreds of miles south of New Zealand, and there is no town nearby, no friendly dock. You can't even see any smoke from a chimney on the horizon. And you look around you, and all you can see are just mountains and fog and cold rain and, water that looks like it has no intention of being kind to anybody. And somewhere behind you, tucked into the trees, there's a little wooden hut. And inside that hut are 5 men. Now, they're not supposed to be there. In fact, a few months earlier, they had left Sydney, Australia, looking for tin. That was the plan: find tin, make some money, and go home. Instead, their ship is broken on the rocks, their food is running down, and the only thing between them and the weather is a house they built from the wreckage. Now, if just those 5 men were the whole story, well, it would already be worth telling. But here is the part that makes this story so strange. Those 5 men are not the only castaways on Auckland Island. Because at the other end of the same exact island, only a few miles away, it might as well have been a whole different world though, there is another crew that has also been wrecked. And they have no idea the first group exists. On one hand, the first group is trying to build a home, and the second group is beginning to fall apart. One of those crews is going to build a forge out of scrap metal and sealskin, remake a boat from the wreckage, and sail back towards civilization. And the other crew, though different circumstances, is going to leave behind a trail of graves. So the question hanging over the story is not merely, could you survive Auckland Island? The deeper question is, what do men become when no one is coming to rescue them? You're listening to Stirring Stories, a special storytelling series from the Sandy Creek Stirrings podcast with your host, Dr. Joshua Jimenez. Here we uncover remarkable true stories from history, faith, and the lives of ordinary people. Stories that still challenge and encourage the soul today. To discover more episodes or to visit our press, visit sandycreekstirrings.com. And now, back to the story. In order to truly understand today's story, we have to first start with Auckland Island itself, because it's not the kind of place that most people would imagine when you say the word island. You think of palm trees and blue water. Well, that's not the place Auckland Island was. It's not the place where you would sit in the sand and in the sun and you would sip something cold. This is the Southern Ocean. Auckland Island lies far below New Zealand. It's in a region of the world where the winds can come roaring around the globe with pretty much nothing to stop them. In fact, sailors had names for those latitudes. They called them the Roaring 40s and the Furious 50s. That tells you something. 19th century sailing captains would come down there because those winds could make a voyage faster. So if you were sailing from, let's say, Australia towards Cape Horn and then Europe, you could dip south, catch those really strong westerlies, and then make better time. Of course, there is a problem with that plan, because that same wind that helps you across the ocean, well, it can also drive you straight onto a coast that you never saw coming. And Auckland Island was very good at not being seen. Fog, rain, sleet, darkness, unreliable charts, poor visibility, you take your pick. A captain might go weeks without seeing land, and then suddenly that ship beneath his feet would suddenly strike a rock. And that is what happened to the ship called the Grafton. Now, the Grafton was a small schooner that left Sydney in November of 1863. It had 5 men on board the ship. Those men were named Captain Thomas Musgrave, a young English sailor by the name of George Harris, a Norwegian man named Alexander McLaren, usually just called Alec, and a Portuguese cook named Henry Forgas. And then there was one more man, Francois Reynal. Now, Reynal is one of those men who, he just seems like he's lived 3 or 4 lives before the story even begins. He was French, about 33 years old. He had spent years chasing opportunity in Australia. He had searched for gold. He had survived sickness. He had been injured. A mine had literally collapsed on him. At one point, an infection caused his face to swell so badly that he was temporarily blind. But along came a day when someone told him that there was valuable tin to be found on an island far south of New Zealand. And of course he thought, well, that sounds promising. I think I'll do that. I think I'll go there. And this is one of those moments where you might put a hand on a man's shoulder and say, Francois, maybe sit this one out. But Reynal did not sit it out. And so a group of businessmen financed the trip. The hope was very simple: find tin, make money, return home. And so the Grafton, that little schooner, sailed first to Campbell Island. You know what they found? No tin. There was none to be found. In fact, it seemed like this was just an imaginary dream, nothing more. So they thought, this whole trip's going to be a waste. Why don't we try sealing? We're going to kill some seals. We can take their skins and the different things we can get from their bodies, and we can try and recover some of the financial, means of this trip. But there weren't even enough seals to be found. So this great business venture began to look like, not very much like a fortune, more like a very cold mistake. And so the men decided to return to Sydney. But on the way, they decided to stop at an island called Auckland Island and see if they could gather just enough skins and oil to make the voyage just a little worthwhile. On January 1st of 1864, the Grafton entered Carnley Harbor, which is at the very southern end of Auckland Island. And at first, this must have felt like the good thing that had happened in weeks. It was a sheltered harbor, sea lions all along the shore. It was a chance to rest, gather supplies. Let's redeem a failed expedition, surely was the thought on every man's mind. But then the weather changed. The barometer fell. The wind rose. One anchor chain broke and the other anchor began dragging. And for more than an hour, the men fought to save the schooner. And just before midnight on January 3rd, the Grafton struck the rocks. Now, this is one of those moments where details really matter because this wreck was terrible. Now, it was not the worst kind of terrible you could have because the ship was hit very hard and the waves would lift her up and slam her down again and lift her up and slam her down again. I mean, the hull was just battered and the men knew they were in grave danger. But the Grafton, thankfully it didn't disappear instantly. She did stay near the shore, and that one fact may have saved every man on board. So Alec McLaren swam through the freezing water and helped get a line to secure that wreck that was happening to the land, and then the man began bringing things ashore by navigating that line back and forth. And they were able to rescue food and tools, and canvas and rope, a rifle, ammunition, cooking gear, navigational instruments, all of these things. And after they had removed the most obvious supplies, they continued to be able to go back to the ship for anything else they might find useful. Now, the Grafton could no longer take them home, but it became something very, very valuable. It became their storehouse. You needed a board, go to the wreck. You needed some metal, go to the wreck. You needed canvas or rope, fittings, nails, scraps, tools, whatever you needed, you could always go back to the wreck. And that's something important to keep in mind in this story, because it wasn't exactly a hardware store, but for 5 castaways on Auckland Island, it was close enough. And very early on, the 5 men had to answer a pretty important question if you're shipwrecked. Who owns the food? Because some of the provisions belonged personally to the captain, Mr. Musgrave, and some of the food belonged personally to Reynal. And under ordinary circumstances, those were theirs. But we have to remember, of course, in this story, ordinary circumstances had just disappeared in Carnley Harbor. There were 5 men, 1 wreck, and not one single promise that anybody knew where they were. So you know what they did? They decided that the food would become common property. Now, don't pass over that thought too quickly, because a story like this one is often decided by things that sound small at the time. The answer to the question, does this food belong to me or does it belong to all of us? And they chose the right answer to the question. Now, at first, when they're shipwrecked on this island, they put up a very rough shelter from sails and whatever they could manage. It did keep off some of the weather, but only some. Auckland Island is definitely not impressed by temporary arrangements. So they began to eat sea lion meat, which Ray now absolutely found revolting. He said it was oily and dark and very unpleasant. But hunger has a way of making a man much less particular, doesn't it? So they ate what they had, slept where they could, and tried to make it through the next day. But after a while, I think it all began to hit them. We're not preparing for a bad weekend here. We are preparing for what might be our very life. And so they set about building a proper hut. They chose a place near a stream, not far from the shore. They took wood from the wreck and they cut what they could from the forest, and they built a fireplace and a chimney, and they made sleeping places and storage, and they named the place Epic Weight. Now, the Captain Musgrave said that the name meant something like a dwelling by the water, and that's why he named it that. They didn't name it the shelter. They didn't name it the camp. They didn't name it, some miserable name like 5 men waiting to die. They actually gave it a name. It's interesting, Epic Weight. If you slow it down in English, Epic Weight, it sounds like epic wait. And that's exactly what they're about to have, a very long wait. But they had a home, nonetheless. It wasn't much of a home. The wind still came, and the island was still very cold. The food was still uncertain, but naming something matters. It was kind of a way of saying, we're not merely hiding here. We're going to live here until God gives us a way off of this island. And that is where the Grafton story really becomes more than just survival. Because these men began creating a little society. What would you do if you are shipwrecked on an island? How would you treat it? Probably every effort would be trying to get off the island, and these men kind of just embraced the situation. Now, Musgrave, he remains as the captain, but he doesn't sit by the fire, expecting other people to work while he's, treated nicely. He worked with them. They divided the responsibilities. They hunted, they cooked, they repaired, they learned each other's skills. And because they knew that they were still men, they were tired men, hungry men, irritable men, they wrote rules for how they would live together. And those rules were written on one of the back pages of Musgrave's Bible. And every Sunday, they would pray together, they would gather there, they would pray, they would review those rules. I mean, a very wonderfully practical thing, right? Sometimes you imagine, unity as a kind of warm feeling. These men knew better. If you were going to have any type of unity and survive together, you needed rules. You need habits. You need a way to settle the trouble before the trouble even arises. And by the way, there was trouble. I don't want you to imagine this story, as I've told it so far, that there's just 5 cheerful castaways sitting around and making inspirational quotes, out of sea lion bones. Now, they argued and they grew discouraged and they irritated one another, and there were days where they wanted to give up. Of course, there were things like that. There were 5 men in a hut at the bottom of the world eating sea lion for supper, but they had built something stronger than just the mood of their situation. They had built order. And in the evening, as the darkness would set in, they would teach one another different things that they knew. Raynal taught mathematics. The men would teach each other different languages. Alec, who had not learned yet how to read, he began learning how to read. They ended up making games. They manufactured soap. They kept journals. And when that ink ran out, they in fact started trying to write with seal blood. Not like sealing an envelope, but like the animal, the seal blood. Of course, that's not ideal stationery, but it does tell you something very interesting, because they weren't willing to just sit around like animals, exist like an animal until rescue came. They wanted to remain men who, they read and they learned and they prayed and they worked and they laughed and, they remembered things and they helped each other. So while they were building Epic Weight into a home, little did they realize that there was another ship that was sailing toward the Auckland Island, but at the very opposite end of the island. And the second ship that enters our story, much like our story from last time, which was the Halifax explosion with 2 ships, this one has 2 ships. The second ship was called the Invercald. And everything about the Invercald's wreck was very much different. For one, the Invercalled was not a little schooner with 5 men on it. It was a large sailing ship and had 25 men on board. They were bound from Melbourne towards Callao in Peru, if that's how you even pronounce it. Her captain was a man by the name of Jorge Dalgarno, and one of the ordinary sailors aboard that will be featured kind of in this story was a young man by the name of Robert Holding. They had been at the sea for 8 days. That's when the weather closed in on them near Auckland Island. It was night, snow and sleet were coming across the deck. I mean, visibility was terrible. And around 2 a.m. on May 11th, 1864, just about 4 months after the Grafton had landed on Auckland Island, the Invercalled struck the northwest coast. Now, their situation and their circumstances, we must admit, they are different. You remember the Grafton. It was broken, it was wrecked, but it was still there. They could make use of it. Well, the Invercalled did not give her crew that mercy. She came apart almost immediately. The hull opened right up, the ballast fell through, waves tore across the deck, men were thrown into the sea. It was terrible. In fact, Robert Holding clung to a part of the stern until the water literally just shook him away and he was gone into the water. Somehow, and we must say, by the grace of God only, he somehow made it to shore alive. And when daylight came, only 19 of the original crew were alive. 6 of them were gone. And the survivors were in a dreadful place. They were beneath cliffs. Many of them were injured. They had lost their shoes. And their ship was breaking up, and they had nothing useful from it. They had a little biscuit and some salted pork. They had some matches, which sounds very ordinary until you're cold and you're soaked and you're standing in a place where rain seems to be part of the landscape, right? So a fire to them was life. This is their rescue. This is their mainstay. Very quickly, though, they almost lost that too. Because the cook, he tried to dry his matches and he burned them all. So the first mate, picks up his matches and he starts to do the same thing with another box until that ordinary sailor, Robert Holding, steps in, takes it away from him. Now that may not have been the proper respect for an officer, but when that officer is about to destroy your last chance of fire, you can probably understand Holding's concern. And the men began to wait for directions on what do we do. And this is where Captain Dalgarno becomes a very sad figure in this story. Now, I don't want to be unfair to him. We have to remember, right? His ship has just been destroyed. 6 of his sailors are dead. The others are injured. They're wet. They're hungry. They're freezing. That kind of shock can knock the strength out of any man. But the fact remains that he did not organize them effectively. For 5 days, here's what they did. They stayed on the beach. That's it. They began to die. And then came one of the darkest moments in this whole story on Auckland Island. The boatswain suggested that they draw lots to decide which man they would kill and eat. Now, Robert Holding, the ordinary sailor, refused to do that, to have any part in this. He would not agree to it. And then he thought, well, if I choose not to have any part in this, you know what's going to happen? They're all going to vote to kill and eat me. He was young. He was the ordinary sailor. The officers were probably not going to vote themselves into the stew pot. So when morning came, Holding had slipped away alone into the forest there on Auckland Island. Now pause here for just a second, because this is really the first place that many people are tempted to make the comparison too quickly. The Grafton men shared their food. The Invercalled men talked of cannibalism. Now, those seem like very, opposite ends of the spectrum, and they are. But you got to remember the conditions were not equal. The Grafton wrecked in a sheltered harbor and remained available for salvage. They were able to get supplies off of it. The Invercalled shattered. On a very exposed coast, it left 19 men with almost nothing. So that matters. It doesn't explain everything, but the deeper failure of the Invercalled was not just they lacked supplies, it was the failure to really rally together as a company. So by the end of May, only 10 of the 19 survivors remained alive. And even in the midst of death And the most terrible circumstances, the old hierarchy of the ship still lingered in the worst possible way. The officers still expected to be served. We're not ordinary soldiers. And the ordinary sailors and the ship's boys, they were sent to gather the food and to fetch the water and to do all the hard work. And Holding later, when he was able, he obviously survives if I'm talking about him in this way, but later he said of these officers, he said they never hurt themselves with work. And that's a brutally efficient sentence that, they never tried to do anything. And on Auckland Island, rank meant very little if it didn't at some point become responsibility, because the rain really didn't care and the cold didn't care who was captain. Hunger never once saluted the first mate. And a title could have helped those men if they had a burden to carry, but instead it became a privilege to protect for some of these men. At one point, in fact, the second mate threatened Holding with a knife because Holding refused an order. Holding picked up a rock to defend himself, and somehow, in some way or another, the matter didn't proceed any further. Now, eventually, we might say luck. Some people might say luck. I would say the hand of God again turned on these men, and they were able to discover something that should have changed everything for them. They found berry bushes that looked cultivated, and then they found a path. Then the remains of buildings. And they found a place called Hardwick, which was an abandoned British settlement at Port Ross. Years earlier, years and years before this time, people had tried to make Auckland Island into a colony and a whaling station. And the promoters had painted a wonderful picture of, this fertile land and beautiful prosperity. But the island, it had not agreed with the brochure. The settlement had failed. It was abandoned. Nobody was wanting to live there. But for the Invercalled men, this was a tremendous discovery. Should have been a turning point. I mean, now they have shelter. There were remnants of human work. There were traces of gardens. There was bits of equipment lying around. And so with energy and leadership, Hardwick might have become the very base for survival. But many of the men did something that, honestly, it's very human. It's kind of expected for a man to act this way in some ways. They began to hope that the settlers would return. Now, you and I sitting outside of this story, we can see the problem. Empty buildings are no rescue plan, right? When you're starving, though, an abandoned settlement can look like a promise. Maybe someone will come home. Maybe someone will return. Maybe if we wait, we won't have to save ourselves. And waiting is a very tempting thing when the work of survival feels very heavy. And because they chose to wait and instead of actually getting to work, the group continued to collapse. Some wandered out and never returned. The two ship's boys were worked until they were too weak to live. The second mate, James Mahoney, was eventually left behind. One sailor became delirious, was pushed away from the shelter, and was found dead the next morning. Now, there's a very ugly detail right here that it belongs as part of the story, though, that another sailor later ate part of that dead man's remains. Now, I don't want to dwell on that, but it does belong in the story because it shows just how completely the bonds between these men had broken. They'd started off as sailors on the same ship, and now they're no longer a crew that can even survive against this island. They were isolated men surviving around one another. Through all this, you still have that ordinary sailor, Robert Holding, still searching for food. In fact, it's only by his efforts and his will and his hunting and finding and work that he was able to keep Captain Dalgarno and the first mate alive. I mean, think about that for a second. You have an ordinary sailor, man with little rank, no authority. He becomes basically the practical leader of the last three. That's right. You heard it correctly. Started off with 25 men, 19 men make it ashore. Only 3 are now surviving for a year. Because it's not till May of 1865 that a passing vessel called the Julian came into Port Ross. And it was there in May of 1865, 1 year after their landing, the 3 men were rescued. And once they were aboard, everything returned to the way it was before. And according to Holding, who recounted the story later, Dalgarno did not allow him to explain what really happened. The captain and the first mate were treated as officers, and Holding was sent below with the sailors. Dalgarno had his rank back, and for a while he also had the story to tell. But here's the very strange thing. When the Julians sailed away from Auckland Island, no one knew that the 5 other castaways were still at the southern end of the island. In fact, the Grafton men were still at Epigwait. And by that time, they had stopped merely hoping for a rescue. They had begun to make it. Christmas Day came along of 1864, so we're stepping back now 5 months back from when the northernmost people, Holding and Dalgarno and the first mate, we're stepping back 5 months after they were rescued, or before they were rescued, I'm sorry. The Grafton men are here Christmas Day of 1864. They had been on the island for almost a full year at this point, and the story really takes a turn. Because until then, they had held out against hope that someone would come, somebody would find them. Surely when the Grafton failed to return to Sydney, that the expedition's backers, they would send another ship. Surely someone would come. But one morning, they just realized after morning after morning after morning, no sail came, and winter had passed and another summer had arrived, and still nothing and nothing and nothing, and Captain Musgrave began to despair. He talked about, maybe we should just take our small little boat and try to make the journey alone. And of course, Raynal, speaking some sense, says, if you try to do that, the boat's so small, these waters are so terrible, you're going to die if we try to do that. And Musgrave's answer was very bleak. If I'm going to die on Auckland Island anyway, what difference does it make? So you can kind of picture the room, not a very nice, quaint little Christmas morning anymore. Just the little house by the water. 5 men who have eaten, they've worked, they've prayed, they've argued, they survived together for nearly a year. And one of them is beginning to think that death at sea might not be any worse than the slow death on land. Now, Raynal is very opposed to it. He would not accept it. If men had abandoned them, he said, then they would have to save themselves. And then he said the words that changed everything. They're recorded as this: courage then, and to work. And that sounds wonderful, but let's be honest about what that meant. They were going to build a vessel capable of taking them hundreds of miles through the most dangerous waters you can imagine. And they had no shipyard. They had no blacksmith shop. They had no proper equipment. They had no store where a man could say, yes, I would like to buy supplies to build a boat, please, and maybe something less disgusting than sea lion for dinner. They didn't have that. So before they could even build the boat, they first had to build the tools. And before they could build the tools, they had to build a forge. And that's why Raynal becomes such a fascinating man in the story. He had been a man chasing a failed tin mine. And now he becomes the man who helped turn failure into escape. So the men start out, they make charcoal. And Raynal fashioned bellows from timbers and metal and sealskin. He gets a heavy piece of iron that becomes an anvil. Copper from the wreck help protect the work area from the weather. And then at the bottom of the world, beside a hut, from a broken ship, the charcoal begins to glow. And Raynal later said that the sound of the bellows was the sweetest music he had ever heard. You know what? I believe him. And for months, the men had listened for a ship. Will there be a ship coming? They had watched for the sails. And now they were listening to the sound of their own work. Because that forge meant they were no longer waiting. They were making fittings and bolts and tools and nails. I mean, imagine the patience in that. One nail at a time. One piece of metal at a time. Nobody was paying them. It wasn't even pleasant work. The only reason they were doing it was because every nail was part of the way home. Now, at first, they wanted to build an entirely new boat. And eventually, Raynal realized, this is way too much to do. We don't have the time. We don't have the tools. We don't even have the ability to do it properly. So they changed the plan. Sometimes courage does not look like refusing to change your mind. Sometimes courage looks like being honest enough to say, this plan doesn't work. The purpose is still good, but this isn't going to work out completely. So instead of building an entirely new vessel, they rebuilt the Grafton's smaller boat that they had brought along with it. So they lengthened it, they raised the sides, they added planking, they made a partial deck, they fitted a mast, they added a pump, and they prepared the water storage. Now, they didn't have any proper pitch. So they began experimenting with lime and seal oil to try and seal the seams. And the finished boat was finally about 17 feet long. 17 feet. That's not a boat that you would choose for the Southern Ocean if you could go down to, the ship Home Depot and, buy some stuff. But they had nothing better. And so you know what they named her? I'll give you a second. Give you 3 guesses. They named her the Rescue. Isn't that brilliant? I love that. They named it the Rescue. There was room for only 3 men. 2 of them would have to stay behind. And finally, July 19th of 1865, the other party on the other end of the island had now been gone for about 2 months. July 19th, 1865 rolls around and the wind looked very favorable. And so Musgrave, Raynow, and Alec are the ones who are going to leave. George Harris and Henry Forgus would remain at Ebbegwait. You could feel the weight of that moment, right? For 19 months, these 5 men had lived as a company, as a group, as a family, we might say. And now 3 of them were going to sail away in a little homemade boat, and 2 were going to stand on shore and watch them disappear. And if the boat failed, the 2 men left behind might never know what happened. That's a scary thought. Now, at first, the voyage went well enough to raise their hopes. And then the weather turned. And for days, that little boat was thrown around the sea. The men were soaked, they were exhausted, and barely able to rest. And then they saw it. They saw land, Stewart Island. And after everything they had endured, safety was in front of them. And then the wind died, and the current began carrying them away. And if you imagine it, it might become one of the most painful moments in the whole story. To survive the wreck and survive the island and the hunger and the forge and the voyage and then see land, your hope and your rescue, and then to suddenly drift away from the land because you're so tired and so exhausted, you don't even have strength to row anymore. Somehow, on July 24th, they reached Port Adventure. And then they found help from a man by the name of Captain Cross, a man who lived on Stewart Island with his wife, and he owned a small vessel called the Flying Scud. So he fed the men, he clothed them, they slept, they were able to regain some of their strength, and then Musgrave, the captain, began arranging for their return because they, of course, still had 2 men waiting. Now, the 2 men left behind, you think, well, they've been a great team, everything's going fine for them. It actually didn't. Harris and Forgus, in fact, argued so badly. They don't know if they're ever going to be rescued. They argued so badly that, in fact, they had discussed separating and living in different places. Let's build a second hut. We don't want to be near each other anymore. It's a very interesting detail to survive because it shows you that this Grafton crew wasn't, some stained glass hero. They were human. And the rules that they created didn't even remove selfishness that happens at times. And the shared suffering, it didn't erase irritation. But the habits they had built over the past 19 months had given them something to constantly come back to. So Musgrave returns aboard the Flying Scud. The weather delayed the rescue, but eventually Harris and Forgus were found alive on Auckland Island. And 7 weeks after the rescue had left Auckland Island, all 5 men, all 5, were reunited in New Zealand. Every man from the Grafton had survived. And on the return voyage, they stopped at the abandoned settlement of Hardwick. And there they found the body of a man by the name of James Mahoney. That's right, we've talked about him before, the second mate from the Invercalled. And it was only then did the two shipwrecks become one story. Two crews, same island, never meeting, never helping, never knowing. One crew left behind a hut, a forge, and the marks of a boat being built. And all the other camp left behind was graves. So what made the difference? Now, it would be very easy to say, well, the Grafton men were good and the Invercalled men were bad. And that's not very fair, right? The Grafton had a better wreck site. They recovered more supplies. They had fewer mouths to feed. They were there longer months, but their ship remained useful even after it was struck. The Invercalled men suffered a terrible wreck in a terrible place, and they began with much, much less. But after we say all that, something still remains. The Grafton men shared what they had, and the Invercalled men failed to ever become one company. The Grafton men used leadership as responsibility, whereas the Invercalled officers used rank as privilege. The Grafton men turned different abilities into common strength, and the Invercalled men left the weakest to become weaker. And on Auckland Island, that difference mattered. Now, there's one thought from this story that I keep coming back to. Before the men of Grafton built the boat, they built the forge. But before they built the forge, they built something else. They built a company. Epic Weight was made of timber. But I'll be honest with you, it was held together by more than wood. It was held together by shared labor, shared food, shared rules, shared prayer, and the decision that one man's strength ought to serve the other man's survival. You know, the Bible says in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 10, 2 are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. You know, that's not just a sentimental thought. On Auckland Island, it was life or death. When Musgrave fell into despair, Raynal had lifted him. When Raynal worked at the forge, the others gathered fuel, they worked the bellows, they prepared the metal, and when 3 men escaped, they came back for the other 2. And that leaves us with a very searching question. Not simply, could I survive if I were shipwrecked? Most of us will never have to answer that question. But we do have to answer this one. Are there people around me stronger because I am there? In my home, in my church, in my work, in seasons of hardship, do I use whatever strength I have to help lift another man? Or do I protect my place, my comfort, and my little portion while others carry the load? You know, a title did not make Dalgano a leader. And a lack of a title did not keep Robert Holding from becoming one. The men of Epic Weight, well, we saw they weren't perfect, but they understood that every family and every church needs to remember the same things that they realized. That if we're going to survive hard things together, we can't merely occupy the same shelter. We have to become a company. Now today, if you were to go to Auckland Island, little remains at Carnley Harbor. There parts of the Grafton are still there, among the stones and beneath the water. At the site of Epic Weight, you'll have traces of the old fireplace have been found. In fact, you'll find a piece of the hearth where those men once gathered. The walls are gone, the roof is gone, but part of the hearth still remains. And maybe that's fitting, because on one of the coldest, loneliest islands in the world, 5 men did more than keep a fire burning. They kept one another alive.